So let's look at the lymphatic system. So if you look at the lymphatic system, this is what it looks like. So this is kind of an overview. And so it's sort of a circulatory system. Looks like this. Well, there's three parts to the lymphatic system. One of these is lymph. So lymph is a fluid is what it is. And what it is that fluid that leaked out of the capillaries. That fluid that leaked out. Now before it was blood, but blood doesn't come out, just fluid comes out. And that fluid that leaks out becomes lymph. And then another part of this system is that there's a network of vessels. They're very similar to veins. They're called lymphatics. And then the third part is that all along these vessels, we're going to have these structures whose job it is to get rid of bad things. They're either lymph nodes or lymphoid tissues. So let's look at lymph. So lymph basically is interstitial fluid. That's basically what it is. It's called interstitial fluid until it enters the lymphatics. And then the name changes and it becomes lymph. It's very, very similar to blood. But it doesn't have any blood cells in it, red blood cells. And it has less protein than what we find in plasma. There's a ton of white blood cells in it. So remember when we talked about how capillaries leak, and we looked at this picture, and we had this equation. Remember there was an equation for net filtration pressure. And remember we said that that's equal to the pressures out minus the pressures back in. And we said that there was only one pressure out. That was blood pressure. And there it is right there, blood pressure. But there are two pressures back in. And so when we looked at this equation, it was net filtration pressure equals blood hydrostatic pressure minus the blood colloid osmotic pressure and the interstitial fluid hydrostatic pressure. And we said that if that number is equal to 0, that means that the fluid moving in both directions is exactly the same. If it's greater than 0, more fluid moves out. If it's less than 0, more fluid moves in. Everybody remember all that? Well, the fluid is this interstitial fluid that comes out, and it's going to enter the lymphatics. So look, here are blood capillaries right here. So here's our arteriole over here, and there's our venule over there. As fluid goes through here, it leaks out. Now remember on this end, when we figure out those numbers, remember on this end, the net filtration pressure was 10, which means a whole lot of fluid leaks out. And it goes in between these cells and goes around the cells, remember, and it drops off oxygen and picks up carbon dioxide. And then when we get to the other end, remember we calculated again, and over here it was -8. So fluid is coming back in on this end. It's coming back in. But not as much fluid comes back in as what went out. Look, if we take 10 and -8, we're going to get 2. And 2 is greater than 0, which means that the net is filtration. Well, that fluid then enters these things. These are called lymphatic capillaries. So the fluid goes inside those. So if you look at where the fluid goes, it starts at this blood capillaries, it leaks out and becomes interstitial fluid, it enters these lymph capillaries and becomes lymph. They look like this. Well, look at them. They look different than regular capillaries. They're different. For one thing, look, they're closed on one end. They're blind-ended. Here's our blood capillary. And look, fluid is leaking out. That fluid, as it leaks out, fills up these tissue spaces. And then what it does is, when the pressure is high, it enters a lymphatic capillary. Once it enters, it becomes lymph. Does that make sense to everyone? And then the lymph is going to enter these vessels. So it's kind of a one-way system because it's blind-ended. It starts with capillaries. And then from there, it's going to go to lymphatic collecting vessels, and then it's going to go to trunks, and then it's going to go to ducts. So when we look at the whole thing, well, somewhere, it looks like a circulatory system, but it doesn't have a heart. So let's look at these capillaries. They're very similar to blood capillaries, but they're more permeable. And the cells overlap each other. So look, they overlap like this. They're attached on one end, but loose on the other end. So they act like little trap doors. And so fluid can get in, but it can't get back out. And so the fluid comes out of the regular capillary and goes in. It can't get back out, and so it has to go this way. Has to go this way. And here's what a lymphatic vessel looks like. And so here you can see how it's attached on one end, but loose right here. It's like a little trap door. So fluid can come in, but when fluid tries to go back, this closes. So they're like little tiny miniature valves. So all this fluid that's out here in between these cells is pushing. It's pushing on here. And as it pushes, it opens and the fluid comes in. So again, fluid can enter, but it can't get back out. We have these lymphatic capillaries basically everywhere. We don't have them in these places. So you don't have any in bones or teeth or bone marrow. You also don't have any in the central nervous system. They're also present in the digestive system. So this picture is a little section of the small intestine. And the small intestine is where most absorption takes place. Well, we digest the food and we get amino acids and we get sugars and we get fats. Well, fats enter the lymphatic system, not blood. They enter the lymphatic system and travel with it. There it is right there. These capillaries have a special name. They're called lacteals. So lacteals are nothing but lymph capillaries that are in the intestines, and they absorb fat. And they take the fat basically to the liver. So this is a picture from one of the labs that we would have if we had had it. But there's a capillary, a blood capillary, inside this small intestine. And there is this lacteal. So amino acids and glucose and things like that go into the blood. But fats go into this lacteal. And here's a real picture of it. There's the lacteal right there. There's a lacteal in the middle, right in there. So when you look at these capillaries, they look very different from blood capillaries. Remember, blood capillaries both open on both ends. One end has the venule, one end has the arteriole. The thing just flows through. And remember, they're leaky. Depending on which type you have, they're either leaky, leakier, or the leakiest. But this one, look, it's closed on one end, has these little trap doors. Fluid can get in, but fluid can't get back out. And from there, we go to the lymphatic collecting vessels. So if we look at the lymphatic collecting vessels, they're very, very similar to veins. They have 3 layers, just like veins and arteries do, but they're thinner. So there's an artery, there's a vein, and there's a lymphatic. Look, they all travel together. You can see them here. So look how thick this wall is. And then here, this is a thinner wall. This one is even thinner. So lymphatics have very thin walls, but they still have 3 layers, 3 tunics. Another way that they're like veins is that they have valves. So there's a valve right there. So if you look at this valve, you can see that fluid can move this way and the valve will open. But if fluid tries to go backwards, the valve is going to close. That's exactly the way we saw in the vein. So fluid can go this way, but it can't go backwards because it gets trapped in there. Fluid can go that way. Does that make sense? Any questions? And then what makes the fluid go through these lymphatics is the same thing that makes fluid go through veins, and that is when the skeletal muscles contract, and also whenever we take a breath. So there's skeletal muscle pump, and then there's a pump that happens with respiration. There is no heart. There is no pumping organ associated with the lymphatics. And so it's completely and totally dependent on these things to make it move. Another thing is arteries pulse. And when they pulse, they push against the walls here, and that also makes the fluid move. So we go into these lymphatics. And if you look at the lymphatics, they look like this. So here are the lymphatics. And as you breathe, as your skeletal muscles work, the fluid gets moved in this direction, and this direction, and this direction. Every time you squeeze it, it moves. And because there are valves, it can't go backwards. And so if you look at lymphatics, there's a bunch of them. Well, the lymphatics then merge, and they form what are called trunks. So when you look at trunks, there's 9 of them. Look, there are 2 lumbar, 2 bronchomediastinal, 2 subclavian, 2 jugular, and 1 intestinal. Well, look, their name tells you exactly where they are. Where's the lumbar? Remember, that's the lower part of the back. And so what this drains is your legs. Look, broncho refers to lungs, mediastinum, that's, remember, the middle part of the heart. This is going to be in the middle of the chest, and it's going to drain the chest. And then subclavian, that's going to drain the arms, 1 on each side, and the shoulders, 1 on each side. And then jugular is going to drain the head. So bronchomediastinal chest, subclavian arms, jugular head and neck, And then if you look at this one, it tells you exactly what it drains. It drains the intestines. So there are 9 of them. And if you look at them, they're not very big. Here are those trunks. That's a trunk right there. That's a trunk right there. These are trunks. And so those are the jugulars, those are the subclavians, those are the bronchomediastinals. That's the intestine, or the lumbar, and that's the intestinal. So 9 trunks. Make sense? Any questions? So, lumbar, again, legs, bronchomediastinal, chest, subclavian, arms, jugular, head and neck, and then these are the intestines. And so basically all the different parts of your body are going to be, this fluid is going to be collecting, and then we're going to go into these trunks. Well, then the trunks also merge. Trunks form ducts, and there are 2 of these ducts. So one of them is called the right lymphatic duct. And the right lymphatic duct, when you look at it, it's this one right here. This is the right lymphatic duct, right there. It's also not very big. It would be right in there somewhere. But it's going to drain all of this. So here it is, right here. There's the right lymphatic duct. If we blow that up, it looks like this. There's the right lymphatic duct. So look, there's a trunk, and there's a trunk, and there's a trunk. They're going to merge to form this right lymphatic duct. Well, when you look at the right lymphatic duct, it's actually quite short and small. It's small. Well, the reason it's small is because it doesn't drain very much of your body. If you look at the amount of the body that it drains, it looks like this. It's only this part, and that's it. So the right side of the head, the right side of the neck, the right side of the chest, and the right arm, and that's it. All of the rest of the body is drained by the left lymphatic duct. Usually the left lymphatic duct is called the thoracic duct because it runs all the way through the thorax. It's a big, long duct. It runs all the way through the thorax. And so when you look at it, it starts right here. And that balloon-like thing is called the cisterna chyli. So that's the cisterna chyli right there. And that's the beginning of this thoracic duct. And look, that's where the intestinal and the 2 lumbar drain into, that cisterna chyli. And so that's where it starts. And look, it goes all the way through the thorax. All the way through. As it gets up to your chest, the left one joins on. The left bronchomediastinal joins on. And then when you get up here, the left subclavian and the left jugular join on. And so when you look at the amount of your body that this one drains, it's much, much bigger. It's all of this. So it's this whole part here. So it's the left side of the head and neck, the left shoulder and arm, the left side of the chest, and then everything below the diaphragm. Everything below the diaphragm. And so that includes the abdomen, it includes the legs, and so on. So it's a much, much bigger duct. So when we look at it here, there's our right one. But here's the left one. Make sense? Any questions? And then that left one, thoracic one, as it comes up, then it's going to drain. And where they both drain is back into the circulatory system. They both drain into veins. So if you look at these, what they are, that's the jugular vein. Jugular vein. And that's the subclavian vein. Same thing on this side, jugular vein, subclavian vein. So right where they come together, right there is where they drain into. So that fluid which came from blood, leaked out of the capillaries, entered the lymphatic capillaries, went through first the lymphatic collecting vessels and then the ducts and now the trunks, is going to go back into the blood. Any questions? That's what that trunk looks like. You see just how big it is. So, if you look at how it flows, here is the right lymphatic duct. And so, this is what it drains. The right side of the neck and head, the right shoulder and arm, the right side of the chest. Goes into the right lymphatic duct, and that finally goes into the right subclavian vein. And then if you look at the left one, look, it's much, much more. Left jugular, the left side of the head and neck, left shoulder and arm, left side of the chest, right leg, left leg, intestines, they all go into this thoracic duct, and then it goes into the left subclavian. Remember, there's no heart on this. And so what's making this fluid move through all of these vessels is the skeletal muscle and respiratory pump, and then the pulsing of arteries. Well, as you go through there, we're going to encounter tons of white blood cells. Tons of them. And we've already talked about white blood cells. Remember, we talked about the granulocytes. These are the granulocytes. We talked about the agranulocytes. We haven't talked about these very much, but we will when we get to the immune system. But they're there as well, too. What we find mostly, though, of all those cells is mostly lymphocytes. And so if you look at lymphocytes, remember they're round cells with a round nucleus. You go back to the picture. These are lymphocytes right here. And remember they come in two types, T cells and B cells. T cells are called that because they mature in the thymus. And B cells are called that because they mature in the bone marrow. Well, we haven't discussed these hardly at all. But these cells are basically the warriors, if you will, of the immune system. And so these are the cells that are going to provide immunity. And there's a whole bunch of talk right now about immunity because of COVID. Whether or not we're going to maintain immunity and so on. There's a whole bunch of talk about antibodies. Well, antibodies are the product of these cells. And so again, these are the warriors of the immune system. Well, they work differently. B cells produce antibodies. T cells physically attack and destroy cells. We'll get to that more. But here's some others. We also have macrophages. Macrophages are big eaters. Dendritic cells are just like macrophages, except they look different. And here's what those look like. There's a macrophage. There's a dendritic cell. They're basically the same, except They look different. So we're going to have all of these cells in the lymphoid tissues. And so when we look at lymphoid tissues, when you look at it, if you look at it inside, what we're going to see is reticular connective tissue. Hopefully you remember that from A&P1. And so we got all these reticular fibers in here, and it forms like a sponge. That's what we talked about in A&P1. It's like a sponge. And inside that sponge are tons and tons and tons of lymphocytes. And so some organs are going to have that reticular connective tissue in there. It's like a sponge. And then in the sponge, we're going to have tons and tons and tons of these lymphocytes, of white blood cells. Well, the main one of these is called lymph nodes. So lymph nodes are sort of bean-shaped. They look like a kidney bean or something. And they are connected to these lymphatic collecting vessels. Well, we don't have them everywhere equally. There are very few in the arms and legs. Where they're mostly located are where things attach to the trunk. And so they're in the neck, they're in the armpits, they're in the groin, and there are tons of them there. So if we look in here, all those little dots that you see, those are lymph nodes. Now there are a few out in the arms and legs, but most of them are not there. They're attached to the trunk. Well, they basically have two jobs. One is to destroy microorganisms, and the other is to activate the immune system. So look, they're bean-shaped. They have this capsule around them, and the capsule extends inside and forms these sort of wall-like structures called trabeculae. So here's our capsule, and there's the trabeculae right there. So they're extensions of the wall, the capsule. But look, it forms compartments. So that's one compartment, and that's another compartment, and that's another compartment, and so on. So we get these compartments. And then if you look in the lymph node, you can see two regions. Look, there's an outer region right here. Looks pretty much the same everywhere you look. That is called the cortex. But if you look deeper in here, you see these round things. And if you look even deeper in here, you see blood vessels and lymphatics. And that area is called the medulla. So we have a cortex and we have a medulla. Here's what a real one looks like. So there's the capsule out there. Here's the cortex, all of this. And in here where the blood vessels and the lymphatics are, that's the medulla. Well, if you look at this picture, what you see are tons and tons and tons of little purple dots, just tons of them. Well, every single one of those little purple dots is the nucleus of a white blood cell. So how many white blood cells do you think are in this one lymph node? Just tons of them. So there they are in there. And what happens is that lymph, that fluid that we collected from outside, travels through the lymphatics. Well, here are the lymphatics right here. These are the lymphatics. They're just vessels. But some of the vessels are going toward the lymph node. Those are called afferent vessels. Some of them are going away from the lymph node. Those are called efferent vessels. So we have afferent and efferent. And look, you can see the valves in here. So the fluid can only flow in one direction. And so the fluid flows toward this lymph node. And so that fluid, when it gets in here, what it does is it trickles all around. And everywhere it trickles before it gets out, it's going to go bypass white blood cells, because there's tons and tons and tons and tons of white blood cells in here. And so those white blood cells then are going to analyze the fluid, and they're going to look for things that are not supposed to be there and hopefully destroy it. So if you look over here, again, every little black dot you see, that's a white blood cell. Here's our afferent, here's our efferent. There's our cortex, and there's the medulla. Well, if you look in the cortex, look, there are these circular-like structures in here. These are called germinal centers, and they have tons and tons of B cells there. We also have T cells too, but the T cells move around. They circulate. So they go with the fluid, and then they go around and they come back. They circulate. But B cells just sort of stay where they are located. Again, if you look at this, those are mostly B cells. And so B cells sort of take up residence in these lymph nodes. And then, remember, we have macrophages in here too, which can phagocytize or eat things that are not supposed to be there. And then there are a lot of these reticular fibers. Remember, there's like a little skeleton in there. So if you look at the lymph node, this is what it looks like. Well, look at the afferent versus the efferent. Look, there are more afferents than there are efferents. We got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 afferents and 1, 2, 2 efferents. What that means is when the fluid gets in here, because fluid comes in faster than it goes out, is that the fluid is going to slow down as it gets in here. It's going to slow down, and it's going to give these white blood cells more time to check it out and destroy what's in there. If you happen to get sick, and so an antigen, something's going to make you sick, comes in here, well, these white blood cells are going to do a couple of different things. Hopefully they're going to destroy this, but before they do, those white blood cells are going to release chemicals that cause these to close. So now look, fluid can keep coming in, but it can't get back out. What do you think is going to happen to the size of this lymph node? It's going to swell up. So if you go to the doctor when you're sick, one of the things they do is they check your lymph nodes. They press in your neck and your armpits and places like that, and they're checking for swollen lymph nodes. And so the reason that swells up, the fluid gets in here, but look, if I close off the exits, whatever that was is now trapped in here. It's trapped. And it's trapped in here with all these white blood cells. And so they have even longer to get rid of it, destroy it. So again, that's what our lymph node looks like. So again, fluid comes in by way of these afferents. It trickles and meanders and all around, just all through there, all over those white blood cells until it exits at the efferent. But there are fewer efferents than there are afferents. And so the fluid slows down, it stagnates so that you have more time to do its job to carry out these protective functions. Well, you can get an infection or inflammation of these vessels. And when you do that, you're going to see what you see are red lines on the skin. So if you look at someone's arm, you see red streaks running down their arm. Those streaks are these lymphatics that are affected, and it looks like that. Another thing that can happen is if you block the flow of lymph, everything downstream of it, it's okay, but if it's upstream, it's going to be blocked. And so all of the tissues that are upstream are going to be blocked, and they're going to swell up. Some people are born without lymphatics, maybe in just one arm or one leg, but they never develop. And so that person has to deal with swelling their entire life. And then finally, another thing that can happen to the lymphatics is they can be infected by a parasite. So this is the parasite. It's carried by black flies and mosquitoes. It looks like this. There it is right there. It's a little tiny worm is what it is, a microfilarial worm. And what it does when it gets in there is it travels to your lymphatics. What happens is the body will build a wall around it. And what we're going to get is an obstructive situation. It's going to block the lymphatics. And so remember what happens if you block it. Upstream, what's going to happen is we're going to get swelling. So if the one that's blocked is in your leg, so here's your foot, and there's your leg, if it's blocked right here, then everything below that is going to swell up. And so the foot is going to swell like crazy. Well, the more of these little parasites you have, the more swelling there is. You get a condition called elephantiasis. And elephantiasis is extreme edema. So again, it's caused by this worm. There's another picture of the worm. Again, it's going to block the lymphatics, so we're going to get this obstruction, and we're going to get swelling. And look at the swelling. So that is fluid between the cells. It's interstitial fluid is what it is. Remember, we're dropping off 3.5 liters a day, but they're not being returned to the blood system. It is staying tissues. And so look at these people. It can happen in the genitalia. It can happen in the arms, the legs. Look at that. That's the man's scrotum. It may sort of look funny and people sort of giggle about it, but think about what his life is like. He probably cannot even walk. Or if he did walk, he would have to use something like a wheelbarrow just to move around. Look at this person. That's a hand. That's her thumb. Isn't that just amazing how much the difference is between these two hands? And the skin often ruptures because of the swelling, and then you get secondary infections, and you have to have amputations. But whatever it is, these people have pain all the time, loss of mobility. And if you look at the skin here, it takes a lot of time, this sort of scaly-like appearance on it, and it looks a lot like an elephant skin. And that's why it's called elephantiasis. So Daryl asks, is there anything to combat the parasite? Yes, there are drugs which will kill the parasite. But remember, the parasite, although it's the problem is our body builds a wall around the parasite. It's like scar tissue. And it's the scar tissue that forms the obstruction, that forms the blockage. So just killing the parasite will not get rid of this. Any questions? Okay, so lymph nodes are not the only lymphoid organs. A lymphoid organ is one with high concentrations of white blood cells, and so we have these other lymphoid organs. The tonsils are lymphoid organs. The thymus, the spleen, the appendix, and then these little things called Peyer's patches. They're all lymphoid organs, which remember they're going to have tons and tons of white blood cells. So let's look at these. Let's look at the spleen. The spleen is actually the largest lymphoid organ. It's on the left side, right underneath the diaphragm. Looks like this. Right there it is. Looks like a giant lymph node a little bit because it still has this bean shape. And it basically does the exact same thing as a lymph node. But it doesn't do it to lymph. It does it to your blood. And so it cleans the blood. It gets rid of anything that's not supposed to be there. It's got tons and tons and tons of lymphocytes in it. It actually has two jobs. One of those jobs we already talked about. And remember, that job is to get rid of old red blood cells. And so remember, with red blood cells, after about 120 days, they get very, very fragile. Well, the spleen has these very small capillaries, and so that's where they tend to rupture. And when they rupture, they release this hemoglobin. And we talked about what happens to hemoglobin. Remember, it goes through this process of biliverdin and then bilirubin, and then it gets excreted, and then it becomes urobilinogen and stercobilinogen and so on. We talked about that. Another thing that the spleen does is it stores platelets. But probably the most important thing that it does, and there's the spleen, probably the most important thing it does is to clean the plasma. And so when the blood gets in here, it gets separated. Red blood cells and white blood cells go in one direction, and plasma goes in another direction. And so if you look at it, there's two very distinct areas in the spleen. And you can see them under the microscope. They look different. They're called red pulp because it is red, and white pulp because it's not red. Well, red pulp is all about red blood cells. So that's where the red blood cells go. That's where the worn out ones and the broken ones and all that stuff go. And so when you look at red pulp, there it is right there. That's red pulp. And red pulp tends to be around arteries. Sorry, veins. Red pulp is all around these veins. But we also have white pulp. It's not really white, but it's not red. But there's tons of white blood cells here, mostly lymphocytes. And what white pulp does is it cleanses the plasma. So there's white pulp right there. It's mostly around arteries, and it cleans the plasma. It gets rid of anything in the plasma that's not supposed to be there. The same way that lymph nodes clean the lymph. So here it's easy to see red pulp, white pulp. And if you look at it under a microscope, it looks like this. So there's red pulp, there's white pulp. Now it's not white because it's been stained. And so that's white pulp, and that's white pulp, and that's white pulp. If you look right there, you can see an artery. If you look right there, you can see an artery. Any questions about it? So again, two jobs. Red pulp, get rid of old and damaged red blood cells. White pulp, that's where there are tons and tons of white blood cells, and they're going to clean the plasma. Any questions? So look at this white pulp. See how many lymphocytes there are in there? Every one of those is a lymphocyte. Now over here, the red pulp, you can see red blood cells, and you can also see lots of white blood cells too. Most of these are macrophages. Not all of them. Okay, let's look at a different one. Let's look at the thymus. So the thymus is where T cells mature. And so what's going to happen with T cells is they are going to start out in the bone marrow, but they're going to leave the bone marrow and they're going to go to the thymus. And there's where they're going to mature. Well, the thymus is an endocrine organ. It secretes hormones. There's a bunch of hormones that come from the thymus, and you probably never heard of any of them. The one good thing about them is every single one of them, the name starts with THY. So they're easy to recognize. But what those hormones do is they make the T cells mature and become competent. Well, this is part of our immune system. And our immune system is mostly growing like crazy when we're children and adolescents. So that's when your immune system is growing. And so the thymus is big. It gets big. It increases in size all through childhood, all the way through adolescence. But then what happens is your immune system is pretty much mature after that. And so the thymus starts shrinking. And it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And by the time you're in your 40s or 50s, you can't even find it anymore. It's gone because its job has been done. It's finished. Here's where it's located. It's located in the mediastinum, right beneath the sternum, right there. And like I said, in children, it's big, but in an adult, it gets much, much, much smaller. Well, if you look at it under the microscope, again, what you see are tons and tons and tons of white blood cells. These are T cells. They're T cells that are maturing. So every purple dot you see there is a T cell. Now, they're not only T cells in there, there are also macrophages and so on. But 99.9% of these purple dots you see are T lymphocytes, T cells. And they're T cells in the process of maturing. And then once they're mature, they leave. But again, it's an endocrine organ because it makes the hormones that cause these cells to mature. And then we have tonsils. Let's look at tonsils. So tonsils form a ring around your mouth and nose. And there are three pairs of these tonsils. There's one pair called pharyngeal, These are up in the nasal cavity, and sometimes they're called adenoids. It's the same thing. And then there's a pair on the back of the tongue. And in order to see these, you have to push the tongue down. So that's why a doctor uses a tongue depressor, so that they can see the base of the tongue and look at these tonsils. And then there's a pair on the soft palate. These are called palatine. And then there's some smaller ones which are around the auditory tubes, the eustachian tubes. But look, they form sort of a circle or a ring around the mouth and the nose. And the reason we have them is because food comes in here, but food and liquid and air comes in here. None of these things are clean. There's all kinds of nasty stuff that comes with it. And so all of these tonsils are there, like sort of the outposts of the immune system. And they have tons of white blood cells in them. And so they can activate the immune system against this stuff that's coming in. And they help to fight off and prevent infection. So if you look in someone's mouth, you can see these tonsils. So those are the pharyngeals. Those are the palatines. Those are the pharyngeals. And then, like I said, if you want to see the lingual, you have to actually push this down in order to be able to see it. It's on the base of the tongue. And so there it is right there, or they are. Any questions? Well, if you look at the surface of the tonsils, they have these little openings. They're called crypts. So food and liquid get down into these crypts, and so does anything coming with the food and the liquid. And so whatever comes down into these crypts is exposed to these white blood cells. And so the white blood cells then are able to activate from that. So those are the tonsils and the thymus and the spleen. We also have sort of tonsils in our intestines. They're not called tonsils though, they're called Peyer's patches, but they're very, very similar to tonsils. And so when you look at a Peyer's patch, there's a bunch of them. All of these are Peyer's patches. They're mostly found in the last part of the small intestine called the ileum. So in the ileum, there are going to be bacteria. And so it's important to have something to fight off these bacteria. So again, these Peyer's patches, like tonsils, are sort of like outposts. And they can encounter and fight off these bacteria. So if you look at the wall of the intestine, here's the wall of the intestine. Now here's where the foodstuffs are and where the bacteria are. So all along the wall, we have Peyer's patches. And so they're exposed to the foodstuffs. And look, that's a Peyer's patch, and that's a Peyer's patch, and that's one, and so on. And so there's hundreds of them in the ileum. And so out here again is where the foodstuffs are, but it's also where bacteria and stuff are. And so the bacteria try to invade your body, but hopefully that is going to prevent that from happening. Try to invade your body, but we're going to kill it. So look how many Peyer's patches there are here. Again, there are hundreds of these things. And then we have another one which is called the appendix. Are they multi-layered? Yeah, they are. They stack up, sort of. So I don't know how many. If you look over here, you can see like 4 layers. But yeah, they are multi-layered. So if you were to draw it, it would be like, they're like this. And they're not perfectly regular. I don't want to say random, but they're multi-layered, yeah. Okay, and then we have the appendix. And you probably have heard of the appendix because you probably heard of someone having appendicitis. And if you don't have your appendix removed, you're going to die. Well, that's true because the appendix can swell, and if it swells enough, it can rupture. And if it ruptures, what it does is it allows intestinal contents into your abdomen. But that's not the thing we need to know about the appendix. The appendix is an important organ. I'm not sure whoever said that it has no use, but that is just not true. It has the exact same use as these Peyer's patches, as the tonsils. And so what it does is it destroys bacteria and prevents them from crossing the wall of the intestines. But it also has another important function, and that is that it has something to do with creating memory for immunity. So when we get to the immune system, we'll talk about how the immune system can remember. Well, the appendix is a place where a lot of this happens. So if you take the appendix out, you lose all of these functions. So when you look at the appendix, there it is right there, and it looks sort of like a worm. So a lot of times it's called vermiform appendix. Vermiform means worm-like. Well, since they're all basically the same, we usually talk about them sort of lumped together. And they're lumped together in what's called MALT. MALT is an acronym. It stands for mucosa associated lymphoid or lymphatic tissue. And so MALT is all about protecting the digestive system, the respiratory system, and so on. And so it includes a bunch of these things. They're all associated with mucosae. So remember the mucosae. There's a nasal mucosa, an oral mucosa, intestinal, all that. All of those mucosae have these little outposts, if you want to call them that, where there are these tons and tons and tons of white blood cells. Any questions? That's the lymphatic system. So that's where we're going to stop for today. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.